Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this travel farther than we imagine. And this one starts with a girl everyone believed had the perfect life. Emily Carter was the kind of woman people noticed the moment she entered a room. Not just because she was beautiful, though she was. Her long chestnut hair framed a face that seemed almost too delicate to be real, and her calm, thoughtful eyes made people feel instantly at ease. But Emily wasn't famous for her beauty alone. She was the daughter of Professor Henry Carter, one of the most respected scholars in the country. For decades, Professor Carter had been a brilliant mind in the academic world. His lectures were attended by hundreds, his books were studied by students across universities, and his name carried enormous influence. Their family lived in a large, elegant home near the university campus, a place filled with tall bookshelves, classical music drifting from the study, and the quiet dignity that came with both wealth and reputation. To the outside world, Emily had everything. A privileged upbringing. A loving father. A future that seemed bright and carefully planned. But what most people admired even more than her family name, was the love story everyone believed she was destined to live. Because Emily Carter had grown up alongside a boy named Peter Reynolds. Peter was the son of her father's closest friend. The two families spent holidays together, celebrated birthdays together, and shared countless dinners over the years. And somewhere between childhood games in the garden and late-night conversations as teenagers, Emily and Peter had fallen in love. It happened so naturally that neither of them even remembered the exact moment it began. By the time they reached their early 20s, their relationship was already legendary among their friends. They were what people loved to call childhood sweethearts. The kind of couple who seemed almost too perfect to be real. Peter was charming, confident, and ambitious. He had a warm smile that could easily light up a room, and he had always treated Emily with a kind of gentle devotion that made everyone around them believe their future was inevitable. In fact, most people already spoke about their wedding as if it were simply a matter of time. Even Professor Carter approved. He trusted Peter. He had watched the young man grow up, study hard, and build a promising career. And in many ways, Peter had become almost like a son to him. For Emily, the future seemed clear. She imagined a life with Peter. A beautiful wedding. A home of their own. A family that would continue the long friendship between their parents. Everything seemed perfectly aligned. Perfect, until the day Emily discovered something that would shatter the life she thought she understood. Because sometimes, the most painful betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we trust the most. And what Emily was about to discover about Peter would change the course of her life forever. The day Emily discovered the truth about Peter began like any other quiet afternoon. Spring had just started to settle over the university town. The air carried the soft scent of blooming magnolias, and sunlight spilled across the stone walkways that wound through the campus. Emily had just finished lunch with a friend and decided to walk across the courtyard toward the small cafe where Peter usually worked in the afternoons. She hadn't told him she was coming. It was meant to be a small surprise. For the past few weeks, Peter had been busy preparing for a major presentation at his company. They hadn't spent as much time together as usual, and Emily thought a quick visit might make his day better. As she walked toward the cafe, she found herself smiling. She was already imagining the way Peter's face would light up when he saw her walk through the door. That was one of the things she loved most about him. Even after all these years, he still looked at her as if she were the most important person in the room. Or at least, that was what she believed. The cafe was crowded that afternoon. Students filled most of the tables, laptops open, coffee cups scattered across the wooden counters. Emily stepped inside quietly and scanned the room. Peter usually sat near the back by the window. And there he was. For a moment, Emily felt that familiar warmth in her chest. But then something about the scene in front of her felt wrong. Peter wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him. Emily didn't recognize her. She was young, stylish, with dark hair falling over her shoulders as she leaned forward across the table. At first, Emily told herself, it was probably nothing. Maybe a coworker. Maybe a client. Peter worked with many people, and she had no reason to feel suspicious. So she took a few steps closer. And that was when she noticed something that made her slow down. Peter was smiling. Not the polite smile he used when speaking with strangers. It was softer. More intimate. The kind of smile Emily had seen countless times when he looked at her. The woman laughed at something he said and reached across the table. Her hand touched his. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Emily stopped walking. Her heart began beating harder in her chest. Maybe she was misunderstanding the situation. Maybe there was an explanation. But then Peter did something that erased every doubt. He turned his hand over and gently held hers. The room suddenly felt smaller. The noise of the cafe faded into a dull blur around Emily as she stood there watching them. Peter leaned slightly closer to the woman and said something quietly. The woman smiled again. Then he brushed a strand of hair away from her face. It was such a simple gesture. But it carried a kind of intimacy that only belonged between two people in love. Emily felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to crack. For years, she had believed that her relationship with Peter was unshakable. They had grown up together. They had shared memories, dreams, plans for the future. Everyone believed they would marry someday. Even her father trusted him completely. And yet, the man sitting at that table looked like someone Emily had never truly known. A strange mix of emotions surged through her chest. Confusion. Disbelief. And slowly, a sharp, growing pain. Emily could have turned around. She could have walked out of the cafe without letting Peter see her. But something inside her refused to leave. Instead, she stepped forward. One step. Then another. Until she was standing directly beside their table. Peter looked up. For a split second, his expression froze. The color drained from his face. Emily, the woman across from him, looked between them in confusion. Emily's voice came out quieter than she expected. Who is she? Peter stood up quickly, knocking his chair slightly backward. Emily, I can explain. Those words. The oldest sentence in the history of betrayal. Emily looked at the woman, then back at Peter. Her heart felt strangely calm. Now. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. How long? She asked. Peter hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was long enough to confirm everything. Emily nodded slowly. For the first time since she had walked into the cafe, she felt tears gathering in her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of strangers. I thought I knew you, she said softly. Peter reached toward her. Emily, please, she stepped back before he could touch her. Then she said something that neither Peter nor the woman at the table would ever forget. I hope she was worth it. And with that, Emily turned and walked out of the cafe. The door closed behind her. But the sound that echoed inside Peter's chest would stay with him for a very long time. Outside, the spring air felt colder than before. Emily kept walking. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that the future she had believed in for so many years had just shattered. And she had no idea yet that the man who would change her life forever was about to step into her story. But that part begins in the next chapter. Emily didn't remember how long she walked after leaving the cafe. At first, her steps were fast and uneven, as if she were trying to outrun the scene she had just witnessed. Peter's shocked face. The woman sitting across from him. The way their hands had been intertwined so naturally. The images replayed again and again in her mind. By the time she realized where she was, Emily had already reached the quiet streets near the university. The campus looked peaceful that afternoon. Students passed by laughing, bicycles rolled along the sidewalks, and somewhere in the distance a bell tower chimed the hour. The world looked exactly the same. But inside Emily, everything had changed. She slowed her steps and finally stopped near a small stone bench under an old oak tree. This was a place she knew well. She had sat here many times during her college years, reading books while waiting for her father to finish his lectures. Today, she sat down heavily and stared at the ground. For the first time since leaving the cafe, the tears finally came. Not loud sobs. Just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks as the weight of everything settled in. For years, Peter had been part of her future. She had imagined their life together so many times that it felt almost real already. Their wedding. Their home. Their family. And now all of it had disappeared in a single moment. Emily wiped her face quickly, embarrassed even though no one was paying attention to her. But just as she stood up to leave, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Emily?" She turned. Standing a few steps away was a tall young man holding a stack of books. His dark hair was slightly messy, and his expression carried the quiet seriousness of someone used to long hours of study. It was John Miller. Emily recognized him immediately. John was one of her father's most talented graduate students. Professor Carter often spoke highly of him at home. "He's the brightest student I've had in years," her father once said proudly. Emily had seen John many times over the years. At university dinners. At academic conferences. Sometimes even at their home when her father invited students over for discussions. John had always been polite, respectful, and somewhat reserved. The kind of person who listened more than he spoke. But what Emily didn't know was that John had been quietly noticing her for years. Right now, however, John's attention was focused on something else. Her face. Her red eyes. The tear marks she hadn't completely managed to hide. His expression immediately softened. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Emily quickly looked away. "Yes. I'm fine." It was the automatic answer people gave when they didn't want to explain anything. John didn't press her. Instead, he slowly placed his books on the bench beside them and sat down at a respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The leaves of the oak tree rustled softly above them. Finally, John said quietly, "You don't look fine." Emily let out a small, humorless laugh. "That obvious?" John nodded slightly. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to keep everything inside. But another part of her was simply too tired to pretend anymore. So she said the words that still felt unreal even as she spoke them. "Peter was cheating on me." John froze for a moment. Not because he was surprised. But because hearing her say it out loud felt like someone had quietly broken something inside his chest. He had always known Emily loved Peter. Everyone knew. Their relationship had been almost legendary among the people who knew them. John chose his next words carefully. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Emily shrugged, though her eyes filled with tears again. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised," she said. "Things haven't felt the same lately." John listened without interrupting. That was one thing he had always been good at. Listening. Emily looked down at her hands. "For years, I thought I knew exactly what my life would look like," she said. "And now, I don't even know where to start." There was a long pause. Then John said something very quietly. "Starting over isn't always a bad thing." Emily glanced at him. For the first time since the conversation began, she noticed the warmth in his eyes. Not pity. Not curiosity. Just genuine concern. John cleared his throat slightly, almost nervous. "If it helps," he added, "Professor Carter always says the most important discoveries happen when the original plan fails." Emily blinked. Then, unexpectedly, a small smile appeared on her face. That sounds exactly like something my father would say. John smiled too. For the first time that afternoon, Emily felt the heavy weight in her chest lift just a little. She didn't realize it yet. But that quiet conversation beneath the oak tree would become the moment her life began to change direction. Because the man sitting beside her, the quiet student her father trusted so deeply, had been carrying a secret in his heart for a very long time. A secret he had never planned to reveal. But soon, circumstances would force that truth into the open. And when it did, Emily's story would take a turn she never could have imagined. The days after Emily discovered Peter's betrayal passed in a strange blur. At first, she avoided the places that reminded her of him. The cafe where everything had fallen apart. The small park where they used to walk together. Even the bookstore they both loved. Every corner of the town seemed to carry memories she wasn't ready to face. For the first few days, Emily stayed mostly at home. Their house, her father's large, quiet home filled with books and polished wooden floors, had always felt warm and comforting. But now even that space felt different. Professor Carter noticed the change immediately. One evening during dinner, he looked up from his plate and studied his daughter carefully. "Emily," he said gently, "has something happened?" Emily forced a small smile. "Nothing important, Dad. Just tired." Her father didn't push further. But he knew his daughter well enough to understand that something was wrong. Meanwhile, across the university campus, John found himself thinking about Emily far more than he expected. He had always admired her quietly from a distance. From the moment he first visited Professor Carter's house as a young student, Emily had stood out to him. Not just because of her beauty, but because of the calm kindness in the way she treated everyone around her. John had never imagined he would one day sit beside her under an oak tree while she told him about a broken heart. Yet that moment had changed something. Over the next week, he found small excuses to visit Professor Carter's office more often. Sometimes it was to ask about research. Sometimes it was to discuss a paper. And occasionally, he simply hoped he might see Emily again. One late afternoon, as John left the university library carrying a pile of notes, he spotted a familiar figure walking slowly along the stone path ahead. Emily. She was dressed simply in a light sweater, her hair pulled loosely behind her shoulders. She looked calmer than the last time he had seen her. Still quiet. But not quite as broken. John hesitated for a moment. Then he walked toward her. "Emily." She turned and immediately recognized him. "Oh. John. Hi." For a brief second, an awkward silence hung between them. Then John held up the stack of books in his arms. "I was just heading to return these. Want to walk with me?" Emily considered the offer. Part of her still wanted to stay alone. But another part of her remembered the quiet comfort she had felt during their last conversation. So she nodded. Sure. They began walking together along the tree-lined path. Students passed by occasionally, but neither of them paid much attention. After a few minutes, Emily spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day." John glanced at her. "What part?" "About starting over." She looked ahead at the path. "For a long time, I thought my life was already decided." She gave a soft laugh. "Now it feels like someone erased the entire plan." John thought about that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes the best chapters are the ones we never planned." Emily looked at him again. There was something steady about John. He didn't rush his words. He didn't try to impress her. He simply spoke with a calm sincerity that felt strangely comforting. They reached the library steps and paused. Emily leaned lightly against the stone railing. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "my father talks about you a lot." John blinked in surprise. "He does?" He says you're the best student he's had in years. John looked slightly embarrassed. Well, I try. Emily smiled faintly. And he says you work harder than anyone else. John shrugged. Hard work is easier than talent. Emily studied him for a moment. For the first time, she noticed something she hadn't really paid attention to before. John wasn't flashy like Peter. He didn't charm rooms with loud laughter or confident stories. But there was a quiet strength in him. The kind of strength that didn't demand attention. It simply existed. After a moment, Emily straightened. Thank you, she said. For what? For listening the other day. John shook his head gently. You don't have to thank me. But inside, hearing those words meant more to him than she could possibly know. Because for years, John had loved Emily silently. He had never expected her to see him as anything more than her father's student. Yet now they were standing together on the library steps, talking like old friends. And somewhere deep inside his heart, a small and fragile hope had begun to grow. But neither of them realized yet that their quiet, growing connection would soon lead them toward a decision that would surprise everyone. Including Emily herself. Over the next few weeks, something in Emily's life began to change. The heavy sadness that had followed her since the day in the cafe didn't disappear overnight. But it slowly became easier to breathe again. Part of that change came from something simple. John. It started with small moments. A short walk across campus after one of her father's lectures. A quiet conversation outside the library. Sometimes just a few minutes talking in the hallway when John came to meet Professor Carter. None of it felt forced. None of it felt like the dramatic romance Emily once imagined with Peter. Instead, it felt calm. Natural. Safe. One evening, Professor Carter invited several of his graduate students to the house for dinner, something he often did at the end of the semester. Emily helped prepare the table, arranging plates and glasses while soft classical music played from the living room. When the doorbell rang, she already knew who it was. John stepped inside with the other students, holding a small box of pastries from a bakery near campus. Good evening, Professor Carter, he said politely. Then he glanced toward Emily. Their eyes met for just a second. Emily smiled. Throughout dinner, the students discussed research topics and upcoming projects. Professor Carter spoke enthusiastically about a new academic paper, while the others asked questions and debated ideas. John spoke less than the others, but when he did, everyone listened. His thoughts were thoughtful and precise. Emily noticed something interesting. Her father looked unusually proud every time John spoke. At one point during the conversation, Professor Carter said with a smile, John has a brilliant future ahead of him. John looked slightly embarrassed. I still have a lot to learn, Professor. Emily watched the exchange quietly. For the first time, she began to see John in a different light. Not just as her father's student, but as someone with ambition, intelligence, and quiet determination. After dinner, the students slowly began leaving the house. Emily walked toward the front door just as John was putting on his coat. Wait, she said. John paused. You forgot your pastries. He laughed softly. I brought them for everyone. Emily picked up the small box and held it out to him. Take some home at least. John hesitated. Then he accepted it. Thank you. There was a brief pause. The night air outside the door felt cool and quiet. Emily leaned lightly against the doorframe. You know, she said thoughtfully, my father really believes in you. John looked down for a moment. He's the reason I'm here. What do you mean? John hesitated, as if deciding how much to explain. Before I met your father, I wasn't sure I could even afford to continue my studies, he said quietly. Emily blinked in surprise. Really? He nodded. Professor Carter helped me apply for scholarships. He recommended me for programs I didn't think I had a chance at. Emily felt a quiet warmth in her chest hearing that. Her father had always believed strongly in helping talented students. Still, hearing how much that support had changed someone's life felt different. I'm glad he did, she said softly. John looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said something that seemed to come from deep inside his heart. So am I. Emily felt a strange flutter in her chest. She wasn't used to feeling this way again. Not after everything that had happened with Peter. Yet something about John's calm presence made her feel steady. Not rushed. Not pressured. Just understood. John glanced toward the quiet street. I should go, he said. Emily nodded. But before he stepped outside, she spoke again. John? He turned. Would you like to have coffee sometime? The question surprised both of them. Emily had said it before she had time to second-guess herself. For a brief moment, John simply stared at her. Then a small smile appeared on his face. I'd like that very much. As he walked down the path from the house that night, John felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Hope. But neither of them could have imagined that the connection slowly forming between them would soon grow into something much deeper. And one day, it would lead them to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The first time Emily met John for coffee, it didn't feel like the beginning of a love story. It felt easy. They chose a small cafe near the edge of campus, far away from the crowded places where students usually gathered. Emily had intentionally picked somewhere quiet. She didn't want curious eyes or familiar faces asking questions. When she arrived, John was already there, sitting near the window with 2 cups of coffee waiting on the table. You got here early, she said as she sat down. John smiled slightly. I wasn't sure how long the line would be. Emily laughed softly. It was such a simple answer, but somehow it made her feel more relaxed. For the next hour, they talked about small things. Books. Movies. Childhood memories. John told her stories about growing up in a small town where his parents ran a modest grocery store. Emily shared stories about living in a house filled with professors, students, and endless academic debates. They came from very different worlds. Yet somehow the conversation flowed naturally. There were no awkward silences. No pressure. Just 2 people learning about each other. By the time they finished their coffee, Emily realized something surprising. For the first time in weeks, she hadn't thought about Peter at all. As they walked out of the cafe, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. Emily stopped near the street corner. Thank you, she said. John looked confused. For what? For making today feel normal. John looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, you deserve a lot more than just normal. Emily felt her heart beat slightly faster. But she didn't respond. Instead, she simply smiled. From that day on, seeing each other became a quiet routine. Sometimes they met for coffee. Sometimes they walked through the university gardens. Other times John visited the Carter house to discuss research with Professor Carter, and Emily would join them briefly before dinner. Little by little, the distance between them began to disappear. Weeks turned into months. Emily noticed how naturally John became part of her life. He remembered small details about her day. He listened when she talked. And he never tried to rush her feelings. One evening in early autumn, Emily and John were walking through the park near the campus lake. The air was cool, and golden leaves drifted slowly across the path. They stopped near the water. Emily looked out across the quiet surface of the lake. You know, she said softly, I used to think love had to feel dramatic. John glanced at her. Dramatic? She nodded. Like something out of a movie. Big emotions. Big promises. She paused. But now I think, maybe love is supposed to feel peaceful. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the leaves scattered across the ground. Then he said quietly, "Peaceful sounds nice." Emily turned to look at him. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. For months, John had been careful not to cross a line. He never wanted Emily to feel pressured. But tonight felt different. Finally, he took a small step closer. "Emily," he said gently. She looked up at him. "I know you've been through a lot this year," he continued. "And I never expected anything from you." Emily's heart began to beat faster. "But there's something I need to say," he said. The wind rustled the trees above them. John looked directly into her eyes. "I've cared about you for a long time." Emily's breath caught slightly. "I didn't say anything before because you were with Peter," he continued. He hesitated for a moment. "But if you ever feel ready to start something new, I would like the chance to be that person for you." Emily stood very still. Part of her had sensed this moment coming. Yet hearing the words out loud still made her heart race. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Emily slowly reached for his hand. "I think," she said softly, "I'm ready to try." John looked at her in quiet disbelief. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "Yes." For the first time since that painful day in the cafe, she felt something inside her heart open again. Hope. And standing there beside the quiet lake, Emily made a decision that would change the course of her life. She chose to trust John. What she didn't know yet was that this choice would lead them toward a future neither of them could possibly imagine. Emily's decision to give her heart another chance changed everything. At first, their relationship grew slowly, carefully, like something fragile that both of them were afraid to break. John never rushed her. He never tried to compete with the past she had shared with Peter. Instead, he simply stayed beside her. Steady. Patient. Honest. And little by little, Emily realized something important. What she felt with John was different. With Peter, love had been loud and exciting, filled with promises about the future. With John, love felt quiet. But it was also stronger. More real. Months passed, and their relationship deepened. They spent evenings walking by the lake, sharing long conversations about life, work, and dreams they had never told anyone else. Sometimes John helped Professor Carter with research at the house, and Emily would sit nearby reading while the two men discussed ideas. Professor Carter noticed the growing closeness between them. At first, he simply observed. Then one evening after dinner, as John was leaving the house, the professor stopped him near the door. "John," he said. John turned respectfully. "Yes, Professor?" Professor Carter studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You've been spending quite a bit of time here lately." John looked slightly nervous. "I hope that's not a problem." The older man shook his head slowly. "No. Not at all." Then his eyes softened slightly. "You're a good man, John." John didn't know how to respond to that. But Professor Carter continued. "My daughter has been through a difficult time." John nodded quietly. "I know." The professor folded his arms. "If you care about her, take that responsibility seriously." John met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Professor Carter held his eyes for another moment. Then he gave a small nod. That conversation stayed in John's mind long after he left the house. Because for the first time, it felt as if Emily's father truly trusted him. Not just as a student, but as someone who might one day become part of the family. And in time, that possibility became real. Nearly a year after their first walk by the lake, John asked Emily to meet him there again. The evening sky was painted with soft orange and purple light. Emily arrived to find John standing near the water, looking unusually nervous. She smiled as she approached. "You look like you're about to defend a dissertation." John laughed softly. "In a way, this feels harder." Emily tilted her head. "Harder than defending your research in front of professors?" "Much harder." He reached into his coat pocket. Emily's heart skipped. John looked at her, his voice steady but emotional. "Emily, the last year with you has been the happiest time of my life." The world seemed to grow quiet around them. "I know you didn't plan for your life to turn out the way it did," he continued. "But meeting you, loving you, has been the greatest gift I could imagine." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. John slowly knelt down and opened a small ring box. "Emily Carter," he said softly, "will you marry me?" For a moment, Emily could barely breathe. Not because she was unsure, but because this moment felt so different from the proposal she once imagined with Peter. This wasn't built on years of expectation. It was built on trust, on healing, on quiet love that had grown day by day. Emily nodded through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. John stood and placed the ring gently on her finger. Then Emily wrapped her arms around him. And beneath the fading light of the evening sky, they held each other tightly. Their future finally felt certain again. Months later, surrounded by family and friends, Emily and John were married in a beautiful ceremony. Professor Carter stood proudly beside his daughter. For him, seeing John become part of their family felt like welcoming a son he had always believed in. After the wedding, Emily and John began their new life together. Their home was filled with laughter, quiet evenings, and shared dreams for the future. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Emily believed she had finally found the happiness she deserved. But life has a strange way of testing even the strongest love. And one unexpected visitor would soon change everything. Because one day, a woman Emily had never seen before would appear at their door. And the words she would say next would shatter the peaceful life Emily thought she had built. For almost 2 years after their wedding, Emily believed she had finally found peace. Life with John was gentle and steady. They lived in a modest but beautiful home not far from the university. Mornings often began quietly, with sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows while John read research papers and Emily prepared coffee. In the evenings, they would sit together on the small porch outside their house. Sometimes they talked about their day. Sometimes they simply watched the sunset in comfortable silence. Emily often found herself thinking how different this life was from the one she once imagined. With Peter, everything had felt dramatic and unpredictable. With John, life felt calm. And that calmness slowly healed the wounds she once carried. John had also begun building an impressive career at the university. His research attracted attention, and Professor Carter often said proudly that John would soon become one of the most respected scholars of his generation. Everything seemed to be moving forward. Until the morning everything changed. It was a quiet Saturday. Emily had just finished watering the plants in their small garden when she heard a knock at the front door. At first, she assumed it might be a delivery. But when she opened the door, she froze. A woman stood on the porch. She looked tired. Her dark hair was loosely tied back, and her expression carried a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. But what immediately caught Emily's attention was her stomach. The woman was clearly pregnant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman asked carefully, "Is John home?" Emily's heart gave a small, uneasy beat. "Yes," she said slowly. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated. "My name is Laura," she said quietly. Before Emily could ask another question, John's voice came from inside the house. "Emily? Who is it?" A second later, John walked toward the door. And the moment he saw the woman standing outside, his entire face changed. The color drained from his expression. Laura, he said under his breath. Emily felt a cold wave move through her chest. You know her, she asked. Neither of them answered immediately. The silence between them suddenly felt heavy. Laura looked at John nervously. I told you I might come, she said softly. Emily's eyes moved between the two of them. Her heart began beating faster. What is going on, she asked. Laura placed a hand gently over her stomach. I didn't know what else to do, she said quietly. Emily felt the world tilt slightly. She looked at John. He was staring at the ground. His jaw tight. John, Emily said slowly, her voice trembling. Who is she? John finally looked up. But instead of explaining, he simply said something that made Emily's chest tighten painfully. Emily. I'm sorry. Those two words felt like a knife. Laura spoke again, her voice filled with quiet emotion. I'm pregnant. Emily's mind struggled to process what she was hearing. Her eyes slowly moved to Laura's stomach. Then back to John. The air around them felt suddenly suffocating. And the baby, Emily whispered. Laura looked down. Then she said the words Emily feared most. It's John's. The silence that followed felt endless. Emily stared at her husband. Waiting. Waiting for him to deny it. To explain. To say that something was wrong. But John didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply closed his eyes briefly. Then he said quietly, Emily. I'm sorry. In that moment, something inside Emily shattered. It felt like history repeating itself. Peter. And now John. Two men she had trusted. Two men she had believed in. Emily took a step backward. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained steady. How long, she asked. John didn't answer. Laura spoke instead. Before you two got married, she said softly. Emily let out a small, broken laugh. Of course. Of course it had started before the wedding. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. Then she looked at John one last time. I trusted you, she whispered. John tried to step toward her. Emily, please let me explain, but she stepped back again. No, her voice was quiet. But firm. Whatever explanation you have. I don't want to hear it. She turned away from the door. Her heart felt like it was breaking all over again. And this time, the pain felt even deeper. Because John had never even tried to defend himself. That silence would haunt Emily long after that day. And soon, it would lead her to make a decision that would tear their lives apart. The weeks after Laura appeared at the door felt like a storm that never stopped. Emily moved through the days as if she were watching someone else's life from a distance. At first, she stayed in the house. Not because she wanted to. But because she didn't know where else to go. John tried to speak to her many times. Every evening he would sit across from her at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his voice low and careful. Emily, please let me explain. But Emily refused to listen. Not because she wasn't curious. But because she was afraid that whatever explanation he had, would somehow hurt even more. So instead, she gave him silence. And silence slowly filled every room in their home. One night, about 2 weeks after Laura's visit, Emily finally spoke the words that had been building inside her heart. They were sitting across from each other at the dining table. Neither of them had touched their food. Emily stared down at the table for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I want a divorce. John didn't move. He had known this moment was coming. Still, hearing the words out loud felt like something heavy closing around his chest. Emily, he said softly. But she shook her head before he could continue. I trusted you, she said. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to remain calm. After everything that happened with Peter, you knew how hard it was for me to trust someone again. John lowered his eyes. I know. Emily looked at him. And yet you still did this. There was pain in her voice now. Not anger. Just deep disappointment. John remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. I never wanted to hurt you. Emily gave a quiet, bitter laugh. Well, you succeeded anyway. Another silence settled between them. Then Emily stood up. I'll stay with my father for a while, she said. John nodded slowly. He didn't try to stop her. He knew he had no right. Within a month, the divorce was finalized. Emily moved back into Professor Carter's large, quiet house. Her father welcomed her without asking too many questions. But he could see the sadness in her eyes. The second heartbreak had changed her. This time, Emily didn't cry very often. She simply became quieter. More distant. Meanwhile, John made a decision of his own. Shortly after the divorce was completed, he resigned from his position at the university. When Professor Carter heard the news, he called John to his office. Are you sure about this? The older man asked. John nodded. Yes, Professor. You have a promising future here. I know. Professor Carter studied him carefully. Is this because of Emily? John didn't answer directly. But the silence between them said enough. Eventually, John left the city. No one knew exactly where he went. And slowly, his name disappeared from daily conversations. Months passed. Emily tried to rebuild her life again. She spent more time helping her father with academic events and charity projects. Outwardly, she seemed calm. But inside, she carried a quiet emptiness. Then one afternoon, someone from her past suddenly appeared again. Peter. Emily was leaving a bookstore when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Emily? She turned. And there he was. He looked older than she remembered. More serious. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Peter said something softly. I heard about your divorce. Emily's expression remained calm. That news travels fast. Peter hesitated. I'm sorry. Emily raised an eyebrow. For what? For everything, he said. For the way I hurt you before. Emily didn't respond. But Peter continued. I was young. I made mistakes. He looked directly at her. But I never stopped loving you. Those words hung in the air between them. Emily didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to walk away. But another part of her felt tired of being alone. Peter took a careful step closer. If you would give me another chance, he said quietly, I promise things would be different. Emily looked at him for a long moment. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of starting over again. What she didn't know yet was that the choice she was about to make would lead her to the most shocking truth of her life. And that truth would appear on the day she was supposed to marry Peter. Emily did not agree to see Peter again immediately. After their unexpected meeting outside the bookstore, she spent several days thinking about what he had said. For a long time, she had believed that part of her life was over. But now Peter was standing in front of her again, older, calmer, and speaking with a sincerity she had never heard from him before. At first, she kept her distance. They met only occasionally. A short coffee. A walk through the city park. Simple conversations about how their lives had changed. Peter no longer spoke with the same careless confidence he once had. He listened more now. And more than once, he apologized again for what he had done years earlier. I know I hurt you, he told her one evening as they sat near the fountain in the park. I can't undo that. But if you ever gave me another chance, I wouldn't waste it. Emily looked at the water quietly. For so long she had been angry with Peter. But time had softened some of those feelings. And after the painful end of her marriage with John, a part of her simply longed for something familiar. Something stable. Something that didn't remind her of betrayal every time she closed her eyes. Months passed. Slowly, Peter became part of her daily life again. Professor Carter noticed it almost immediately. One evening at dinner, he placed his fork down and looked at his daughter. "You've been seeing Peter again." Emily didn't deny it. "Yes." Her father watched her carefully. "Are you certain that's wise?" Emily sighed quietly. "I know what he did, Dad." Professor Carter nodded. "But sometimes people truly change." The older man didn't respond right away. Finally he said gently, "Just be careful, Emily." "I will." And for a while, things did seem different. Peter was attentive. Patient. More mature than the young man who had broken her heart years ago. Then one evening, nearly a year after they had reconnected, Peter asked Emily to meet him at the same park where they used to spend time when they were younger. The sky was turning golden as the sun began to set. Emily arrived to find Peter standing beside the old oak tree. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. "You're late," she teased lightly. Peter laughed softly. "I needed a few extra minutes to work up the courage." Emily tilted her head. "For what?" Peter reached into his jacket pocket. And suddenly Emily's heart skipped. He pulled out a small velvet ring box. For a brief moment, Emily simply stared at it. Peter opened the box slowly. Inside was a beautiful diamond ring. "Emily," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve another chance after everything I did." His voice was steady, but emotional. "But loving you has never stopped being the most important thing in my life." He looked directly into her eyes. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you deserved all along." Then he knelt down. "Will you marry me?" Emily stood completely still. The moment felt strangely familiar. Years ago, she had once imagined this exact scene. A future with Peter. A life they had once promised each other. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she slowly nodded. "Yes." Peter's face lit up with relief and joy. He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. This time, there were no doubts in his expression. Only determination. 6 months later, preparations for their wedding filled every corner of Emily's life. The ceremony was planned to be elegant and grand. Friends, family, and colleagues of Professor Carter were invited. Emily even went to a professional studio with Peter to take their wedding photos. As she stood in front of the mirror during one of her dress fittings, she studied her reflection quietly. The white dress was beautiful. Her hair was carefully styled. Anyone looking at her would see a woman preparing for one of the happiest days of her life. But deep inside, Emily still felt a small, unexplainable heaviness in her chest. She told herself it was just nerves. Every bride felt nervous before her wedding day. The morning of the ceremony finally arrived. The venue was decorated with flowers and soft music filled the air as guests slowly began arriving. Emily stood in the bridal room wearing her wedding dress, staring at herself in the mirror. In just a few minutes, she would walk down the aisle. Her future with Peter was about to begin. Then someone knocked on the door. Emily assumed it was one of the wedding planners. "Come in," she called. The door slowly opened. And when Emily saw who was standing there, her entire body went still. It was a woman she had never expected to see again. Laura. The same woman who had appeared at her door years earlier. The woman who claimed to be carrying John's child. Laura stepped into the room slowly. Her expression was serious. And the moment their eyes met, Emily felt an uneasy chill run down her spine. Because something about this unexpected visit felt like the beginning of a truth she had never been told. And whatever Laura was about to say next would change everything Emily believed about her past. including the man she had once loved, and the man she was about to marry. For a few seconds, Emily couldn't move. Standing in front of her, in the quiet bridal room, was the last person she ever expected to see again. Laura. The woman who had appeared at her door years ago. The woman who had destroyed her marriage. Emily felt her heartbeat begin to race. "What are you doing here?" she asked slowly. Laura closed the door behind her. The sounds of music and conversation from the wedding hall became faint through the walls. Guests were arriving. In just a few minutes, Emily was supposed to walk down the aisle. But suddenly none of that seemed real anymore. Laura stood a few feet away, her hands clasped nervously together. "I know this isn't the right time," she said quietly. Emily's voice sharpened. "Then why are you here?" Laura hesitated. "I had to tell you the truth." Emily felt a cold wave pass through her chest. "The truth," she repeated. Laura nodded. "Yes." Emily crossed her arms. "I already know the truth," she said bitterly. "You came to my house pregnant and told me the baby was John's." Laura looked down at the floor. "That's what I said." Emily's voice hardened. And John never denied it. The memory of that day still burned inside her. John's silence. His apology. The way he had accepted her anger without defending himself. Emily looked directly at Laura. "So why are you here now?" Laura slowly raised her eyes. "Because it wasn't true." The words hung in the air. Emily blinked. "What?" Laura took a shaky breath. The baby wasn't John's. For a moment, Emily thought she had misheard her. "That's not funny," she said coldly. "I'm not joking." Emily stared at her. "If the child wasn't John's, then why did you say it was?" Laura swallowed. Her voice trembled slightly. "Because someone asked him to take the blame." Emily felt a strange unease growing in her chest. "Who?" Laura hesitated. Then she said the words that made the room suddenly feel smaller. "Your father." Emily froze. "My father?" Laura nodded slowly. Tears were beginning to form in her eyes. "I worked as a research assistant for Professor Carter," she explained. "One night after a conference dinner, things happened that shouldn't have happened." Emily's stomach twisted. Laura continued, her voice quiet but steady. "When I found out I was pregnant, I panicked." Emily felt the world beginning to tilt. "I went to see Professor Carter." Laura wiped a tear from her cheek. He was terrified that the truth would destroy his reputation, his career, everything. Emily could barely breathe. "And John," she whispered. Laura's voice softened. "John overheard part of our conversation." She paused. "He knew how much he respected your father." Emily's chest tightened painfully. "And he knew how much you loved your father too." Laura looked at her carefully. "So he made a decision." Emily's voice was barely audible. "What decision?" Laura answered quietly. "He told me to say the baby was his." The room spun. Emily took a step backward and grabbed the edge of the table for support. "That's impossible," she said weakly. Laura shook her head. "It's the truth." Emily's mind raced back to that day at the front door. John's face. His silence. His apology. He had never once tried to defend himself. Because he had been protecting someone else. Laura continued softly. "He said it was the only way to protect Professor Carter." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "And to protect you." The weight of those words crashed over her. For years, she had believed John betrayed her. She had divorced him. She had watched him leave the city without fighting for himself. All because he chose to protect her father. Emily slowly sank into the chair beside the mirror. Her hands were trembling. "Why tell me now?" she whispered. Laura looked toward the wedding dress hanging behind her. Because today you're about to marry someone else. She stepped closer. And John lost everything to protect your family. Emily felt tears streaming down her face now. Laura's voice softened. I thought you deserved to know the truth before it's too late. Outside the room, the music for the ceremony had begun to play. Someone knocked lightly on the door. Emily, it's time. But Emily didn't move. Her heart was racing. Her mind filled with memories of John. His kindness. His patience. The way he had quietly loved her without asking for anything in return. And suddenly she realized something that shattered her all over again. The man she had believed betrayed her, had actually sacrificed everything for her. Emily slowly stood up. Her hands clenched the fabric of her wedding dress. Because in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. And the decision she was about to make would shock every single person waiting outside that door. For a moment, Emily simply stood there in the bridal room. The soft music from the ceremony drifted faintly through the door. Guests were seated. The aisle was waiting. Peter was waiting. But everything inside Emily had changed. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The white dress. The carefully styled hair. The diamond ring Peter had placed on her finger. Just minutes ago, she had believed she knew exactly what her future would look like. Now, that future suddenly felt like a lie. Behind her, Laura spoke quietly. Emily. I'm sorry. Emily slowly wiped the tears from her face. This isn't your fault, she said softly. For years, she had blamed the wrong person. John had never betrayed her. He had sacrificed himself. He had accepted her anger. Her accusations. Even the divorce. All to protect the reputation of her father. Emily's chest tightened painfully. She remembered the last time she had seen John. The sadness in his eyes. The way he had quietly left the city without defending himself. And suddenly she realized something that made her heart ache. He had never stopped loving her. He had simply let her go. Outside the door, someone knocked again. Emily, everyone's ready. Emily closed her eyes for a moment. Then she made her decision. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. I can't do this. Laura looked at her carefully. You're sure? Emily nodded. Yes. She took a deep breath, lifted the skirt of her wedding dress slightly, and walked toward the door. When she stepped into the hallway, the wedding coordinator looked confused. Emily? The ceremony is starting. But Emily didn't stop walking. Moments later, the large doors of the ceremony hall opened. Every guest turned toward her. The music stopped. Peter stood at the end of the aisle, smiling at first. But the moment he saw Emily's face, his expression changed. Emily walked slowly down the aisle. Not toward the altar. But toward Peter. When she reached him, the room was completely silent. Emily? Peter asked softly. She looked at him with sad but honest eyes. I'm sorry. Peter frowned slightly. What do you mean? Emily took off the engagement ring and gently placed it in his hand. I can't marry you. A quiet gasp moved through the guests. Peter stared at the ring in disbelief. Emily, what are you talking about? But she shook her head. There are things I only learned today. Peter looked stunned. But Emily had already turned away. She walked quickly down the aisle, past the rows of shocked guests, and out of the building. Outside, the afternoon sunlight felt almost blinding. Emily hurried to her car, her heart pounding. There was only one place she needed to go. Hours later, Emily stood in front of a small house on the edge of another town. It had taken time to find the address. But she finally had. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slowly opened. And there he was. John. He looked surprised. Older. More tired than she remembered. But the moment he saw her standing there in a wedding dress, his eyes widened. Emily? For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Emily stepped forward, tears already filling her eyes. I know the truth, she said. John's expression changed slightly. Laura told you, he said quietly. Emily nodded. Why didn't you tell me? John looked down for a moment. Then he said softly, because it would have destroyed your father. Emily's voice broke. You let me hate you. John gave a small, sad smile. I thought it was the best way to protect everyone. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. You lost everything. John shrugged gently. It was worth it if you were happy. Emily took another step closer. Her voice trembled. I wasn't. John looked at her, surprised. For a moment, they simply stood there. Then John noticed something. The white dress. The veil. The soft lace sleeves. He smiled gently. And said the words Emily would remember for the rest of her life. You look beautiful in a wedding dress. Emily let out a small, tearful laugh. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. This time, she wasn't letting him go. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't the ones that begin perfectly. They are the ones that survive the truth. And finally find their way back to each other.